Bruno had been there for so long that he had become invisible. An old dog, forgotten in the shadows of the shelter, like an old book collecting dust on a shelf no one cared to browse. Every day, families walked past his kennel, their eyes lighting up at the sight of playful puppies and energetic young dogs. The laughter of children filled the air as tiny paws pressed against the metal fences, tails wagging furiously, eager to be chosen. But Bruno, he didn't even lift his head anymore. He had learned the truth the hard way. No one was coming for him. The shelter was always alive with noise, sharp barks, excited yelps, the constant chatter of people searching for their perfect companion. But in the farthest corner, where the dim lights barely reached, Bruno lay silently in his kennel. He was an elderly German shepherd, his body frail and thin, his once glossy coat now dull and patchy. His deep brown eyes, once so full of life, held nothing now but quiet resignation. Day after day, he watched as the world moved on without him. He saw puppies being scooped up in loving arms, young dogs being led out with wagging tails, ready to start their new lives. Some dogs were adopted within hours, others within weeks. But Bruno had been here for over a year. No one wanted an old, slow dog with cloudy eyes and stiff legs. The shelter staff tried their best. They posted about him online, hoping for a miracle. They even placed a sign on his kennel, "Loyal and gentle, just needs a chance." But no one read it. No one cared. Bruno stopped hoping. So when the shelter doors swung open one morning, he didn't bother looking up. It was just another day, another stranger who wouldn't notice him, another family who would fall in love with a younger, cuter dog. But this time was different. A woman had just stepped inside, and for some reason, her eyes weren't scanning the kennels filled with bouncing, excitable dogs. She was looking directly at him. Bruno remained curled up in his corner, pressed against the cold concrete floor, wrapped in a thin, worn-out blanket that barely provided comfort. Around him, the younger dogs barked eagerly, tails wagging, paws scraping against metal fences, their tongues hanging out as they fought for attention. But this woman, she wasn't looking at them. She was looking at him. Bruno hesitated. Nobody ever stopped for him. Elena Foster, 44 years old, hadn't even planned on adopting a dog that day. She had only come to the shelter to look, or at least, that's what she told herself. But as she crouched down in front of Bruno's kennel, her hands resting on her thighs, something inside her chest tightened. She had seen many shelter dogs before, but this one was different. He wasn't barking. He wasn't wagging his tail, trying to charm his way into a home. He had given up. And something about that shattered her heart. A shelter worker approached with a warm smile. "Are you interested in one of the younger ones?" she asked kindly. "We have some great German Shepherd mixes in the next row." "No," Eleanor cut in softly, her eyes never leaving Bruno. "Tell me about this one." The worker hesitated before glancing at the old dog. "Oh, Bruno. He's been here for over a year now," Elena swallowed. "A year. Has anyone ever shown interest?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. The worker sighed, shaking her head. "No. People want puppies. Younger dogs. They take one look at him and walk away." Elena pressed, her lips together, then slowly extended her hand through the kennel bars. Bruno didn't move. She could see the hesitation in his tired eyes. Was she like the others? Would she give him a moment of hope, only to walk away like everyone else? Elena waited. She didn't speak. She didn't rush him. Her fingers rested just inside the kennel. Bruno shifted ever so slightly, just enough to sniff her fingertips. And in that tiny movement, everything changed. He had seen hands before, hands that patted the younger dogs, hands that lingered for a second before pulling away. But this time felt different, because this time, the hand stayed. Elena waited. She didn't rush him, didn't speak. She simply remained still, her hand resting just inside the kennel, letting Bruno decide what happened next. For a long moment he hesitated. His cloudy brown eyes studied her, searching for something. Maybe a reason to trust, maybe a reason to turn away. Would she leave? Would she just be another stranger who stopped, pitied him for a moment, and then moved on? His frail body tensed as he sniffed her hand. The scent was different. Not like the perfume of passing visitors, not like the artificial smell of the shelter workers who came and went. It smelled warm, familiar, like home. His ears twitched slightly. She didn't pull away, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Bruno lifted his head. Just a little. Elena swallowed hard. The moment his nose touched her fingers, something inside her cracked. This wasn't just an old dog. This was a soul who had given up on being loved, and somehow, in that single fragile movement, he had just let her in. A shelter worker standing nearby shifted uncomfortably. Bruno doesn't react to most people, she admitted. He spends most of the day sleeping. He hardly eats. Eleanor's fingers curled slightly. Hardly eats. She glanced inside the kennel at the untouched food bowl. Her chest tightened. He wasn't just forgotten. He was fading away. She exhaled, finally breaking her silence. Why was he surrendered? The worker hesitated before answering. His owner passed away. The family didn't want him. They brought him here and never came back. Eleanor felt her throat tighten. He lost everything. His home, his person, his purpose. And now, he was just waiting for nothing. The worker sighed. We've tried. We've posted about him online, put his story on flyers, even reduced his adoption fee. But people want younger dogs, active dogs. She trailed off, shaking her head. No one wants a senior dog. Elena slowly stood up, still looking at Bruno. His eyes were locked onto hers now. Not hopeful, not excited, just waiting. Like he was trying to understand something. Like he was trying to figure out why, after all this time, someone was really looking at him. The weight of it was suffocating. Elena clenched her jaw. No one wants a senior dog. She felt the anger simmer beneath her skin. Then I guess I'm no one. She turned to the shelter worker and said 5 words that changed everything. I want to meet him. The shelter worker blinked. You want to meet Bruno? Elena nodded, no hesitation. Yes. She expected the worker to smile, to be relieved that someone had finally shown interest in him. But instead, the woman sighed, rubbing the back of her neck. I have to be honest with you, she said carefully. Bruno doesn't do well outside his kennel. Eleanor frowned. What do you mean? The worker motioned toward the gate. Come with me. You'll see. Bruno hadn't left his kennel in weeks. Even when the staff tried to walk him, he would take a few hesitant steps, then stop. Some dogs pulled eagerly at their leashes, desperate to run, to feel the grass beneath, their paws. But Bruno, he just stood there, waiting to go back inside, like he didn't believe there was a reason to leave. The worker unlatched the kennel door and slowly stepped inside. Bruno didn't move. His deep brown eyes flickered toward Eleanor as if asking, Are you still here? Elena's chest tightened. She crouched down again, staying at his level. Come on, buddy, she whispered gently. Let's go outside for a little bit. Bruno didn't react. Did he even understand? Did he even care? The worker carefully slipped a leash over his neck. Bruno tensed. His frail body stiffened. Eleanor held her breath. And then, slowly, carefully, he stood up, not eagerly, not with excitement, but with effort. His stiff legs trembled. His thin frame wobbled, struggling to hold his weight. Elena could see every rib beneath his dull fur. He was so much weaker than she realized. Her heart ached. But she didn't say a word. She just held the leash, gently, giving him time. Bruno took one step, then another. Then he stopped. He wouldn't move any further. The shelter worker sighed. This is what I meant. He doesn't trust it. He's spent so long inside the kennel. He doesn't know what to do anymore. Elena swallowed the lump in her throat. This wasn't just a dog that needed a home. This was a dog that had forgotten how to live. She wasn't just going to rescue him. She was going to bring him back to life. Elena knelt beside him again. Bruno looked up at her. For the first time, she saw something new in his eyes. It wasn't fear. It wasn't sadness. It was a question. Can I trust you? Elena reached out and gently stroked his head. She whispered 2 words that changed everything. Let's go. And this time, Bruno took another step forward. His legs trembled as he stepped out of the kennel. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was outside. The open space of the shelter's outdoor area stretched before him, just a simple fenced-in yard with patches of grass. But to Bruno, it might as well have been another world. The yard was simple, patches of dry grass, a few old chew toys scattered around. To most dogs, it was freedom. To Bruno, it was the unknown. He hesitated at the threshold, his frail body stiff with uncertainty. The fresh air ruffled his dull fur. His ears twitched at the distant sound of barking, but he didn't move. Elena knelt beside him, holding the leash loosely in her hand. It's okay, Bruno, she said softly. We can take it slow. Bruno lowered his head slightly, eyes scanning the ground. His tail remained tucked, his posture hesitant. But he was outside, for the first time in months, maybe longer. Elena stayed still, waiting. She wasn't going to force him. She wasn't going to rush him. Bruno took a single step, then another. His movements were slow, uncertain. His legs were still weak, his breathing heavy from the small effort. But he was trying, and for the first time, Elena saw his nose lift slightly, sniffing the air. Something inside her tightened. That small movement, just a breath of fresh air, was proof. Bruno wanted to believe. Maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't done with him yet. The shelter worker leaned against the fence, watching, in quiet disbelief. I've never seen him like this, she admitted. He usually just stands by the door, waiting to go back inside. Elena glanced at Bruno, her fingers tightening around the leash. Maybe he's just been waiting for the right person. The worker exhaled. Are you sure you want to do this? Taking in a senior dog is not easy. Elena looked back at Bruno, at his greying muzzle, his thin frame, the way his deep brown eyes looked at her now. Not with expectation, not even with hope, but with something quieter. Trust. He had lost everything, his home, his person, his purpose. But she wasn't going to let him lose his last chance. Elena turned to the worker, her voice steady. I'm sure. The worker nodded, a small smile appearing. Then let's do the paperwork. Elena exhaled and turned back to Bruno. She crouched down, meeting his eyes. What do you say, big guy? Bruno blinked slowly, his tired body still, his expression unreadable. Then, for the first time, he wagged his tail. It was weak, barely a movement, but it was enough. Bruno had never ridden in a car before. At least, not that he could remember. Elena had to lift him gently into the back seat, his frail body too weak to jump. He didn't resist. He simply let himself be carried, his deep brown eyes scanning her face as if still trying to understand why she was doing this. She settled him onto a soft blanket and shut the door. For the first time, he wasn't in a kennel. He wasn't behind bars. He wasn't in the cold, empty shelter. He was in a car. Going somewhere. Going home. The ride was quiet. Bruno lay curled up in the back, his breathing slow and steady. Elena kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror. He looked so small for such a big dog. So tired. Every bump in the road made him shift slightly, his thin frame adjusting on the blanket. But he didn't panic. He didn't whine. He simply accepted it, like a dog who had given up on fighting. Elena's hands tightened on the wheel. She had no idea what kind of life Bruno had before the shelter. She didn't know what he had been through, but she knew one thing for sure. He was never going back. When they arrived, Elena opened the car door and crouched beside him. Bruno lifted his head slightly, blinking at his new surroundings. A small, cozy house. A fenced yard. Quiet. Peaceful. Elena gently reached for his leash, giving it a soft tug. "Come on, buddy. Let's go inside." Bruno hesitated. He had stepped out of his kennel. He had stepped out of the shelter. But this was a home, and for a dog who had lost one before, that was terrifying. His deep brown eyes searched Elena's face, waiting for reassurance. She smiled softly. "You're safe now, Bruno." Bruno let out a small breath. Then, finally, he took a step forward. Bruno's paws hesitantly touched the soft wooden floor. He paused in the doorway, his deep brown eyes scanning the space. No cold concrete, no metal bars, no distant echoes of barking dogs. Just quiet, just warmth. Elena let go of his leash, stepping back to give him space. "Go ahead, big guy. This is yours now." Bruno's ears flicked slightly at her voice. He took another step forward, then another. His frail legs trembled slightly, his thin frame shifting unsteadily as he slowly explored the home. A soft dog bed lay near the fireplace, waiting for him. A fresh water bowl sat beside it. Everything was his. For the first time in a very long time, he had a place of his own. Elena watched him carefully, giving him time. She knew better than to rush him. This wasn't just a house for him. This was trust, and trust takes time. Bruno sniffed the air, his tail still low, still uncertain. And then, he did something unexpected. Instead of curling up on the dog bed, instead of lying down in the warmest spot, he walked to her, slow, hesitant, and then with the last bit of trust he had left in him, he rested his head against her leg. Elena's breath hitched. She reached down, gently running her fingers through his dull fur. "You're safe now." Bruno, for the first time, he let out a deep, heavy sigh. His tail, weak but finally free of fear, gave a single, slow wag. And in that moment, Elena knew. He understood. He was home, left behind by hope. But sometimes all it takes is one person to change everything. One person to see the invisible. One person to say, "You still matter." Elena didn't just rescue Bruno. She gave him back his dignity, his trust, his life. And in return, Bruno gave her something even greater, a love that had been waiting just for her. Bruno wasn't broken. He was just waiting for someone to believe in him. And now, he's home. Forever. But how many other dogs like Bruno are still waiting? Dogs who have lost hope. Dogs who just need one person to see them. If this story touched your heart, consider visiting your local shelter. There's a Bruno waiting for someone like you. Subscribe for more stories like this. And if you believe every dog deserves a second chance, leave a like. Share this story, because sometimes one person really can change everything.